It is the middle of the night, and you are awake. You don't know what woke you. There was no sound, because out here there is almost never any sound, and that is part of what you are still getting used to. Back where you came from, there were neighbours close enough to hear, a town with its small noises, church bells on Sunday, and the ordinary music of other people living their lives within reach of yours. Here there is the wind, and the wind is not a sound so much as a presence, a thing that leans against the walls all night long and never quite stops, and underneath the wind there is nothing at all. You lie in the dark of a single room that smells of earth, because the walls are made of earth, cut from the ground in heavy bricks and stacked into something that is meant to be a house. The roof above you is also earth, packed sod and grass roots, and somewhere up there in the spring, a few wildflowers are blooming out of your ceiling, which is either the loveliest thing you have ever seen or a small private joke that the prairie is telling at your expense, depending on the kind of night you are having. You reach out in the dark and you can feel your children breathing. That is the one thing that anchors you. They are alive and warm and close, and tomorrow you will get up before the sun, and you will keep them that way for one more day. The way you did yesterday, and the way you will do tomorrow, because keeping them alive is the entire work of your life now, and there is no one out here to do it but you. And lying there, listening to the wind, you let yourself think the thought you do not say out loud in the daytime. You think, I am so far from home. You think, I did not choose this. And you think about your mother, hundreds of miles behind you, on the other side of a journey so long and so dangerous, that you both knew, on the morning you left, that you would almost certainly never see each other again in this life. She held your face in her two hands, and then you climbed up onto the wagon, and the wagon began to move, and that was the last of it. Hey guys, tonight, we are going to sit with that woman. Not the woman in the painting, with a clean blue dress and the brave little smile, and the wholesome golden light. Not the cheerful pioneer mother of the bedtime story, baking bread in a tidy cabin while the prairie rolls picturesquely past the window. That woman is a comfortable fiction. And we have been told her version of the story for a very long time, because it is a great deal easier to look at than the truth. Tonight we are going to put that painting away, gently, and we are going to look instead at the real woman who actually lived this life. The one who was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The one who buried things out here that she never spoke of again. The one whose name, in most cases, nobody bothered to write down at all. This is the story of what life was actually like for women on the American frontier. Not the legend, the life. And it is, I think, one of the most quietly astonishing stories there is, because these were ordinary women, no stronger or braver than anyone you have ever met, who were asked to endure something close to unendurable, and who got up every single morning and endured it anyway, without applause, without rest, and very often without any choice in the matter whatsoever. If you find these forgotten lives worth remembering, do me a small kindness and subscribe to the channel before we go any further, because the people we talk about here were written out of the comfortable version of history, and every subscriber is one more person helping to keep their real stories from disappearing entirely. That is all I will ask of you tonight. Now let the fire burn down and settle in, and let us begin where her story really began. Not on the prairie, but on the morning she had to leave everything she had ever known to get there. We have to begin by correcting something, because almost everything about the way we picture the start of this story is wrong. And the very first thing we get wrong is the matter of choice. When you imagine a family setting out for the West, you probably imagine them deciding together. A husband and a wife at a table, talking it over, weighing the risk against the dream, taking each other's hands and agreeing, as partners, to be brave. It is a nice image. For a great many of the women who actually made this journey, it bore very little resemblance to what happened. The decision to go west was, overwhelmingly, a decision made by men. It was made by a husband who had heard about land, or by a father who had failed at something where he was and wanted to begin again somewhere new, or by a restless brother whose enthusiasm swept the whole family up in its wake. And the women in these families, the wives and the daughters and the mothers, were very often simply informed. The decision arrived in their lives the way weather arrives. It was not theirs to make, it was theirs to survive. This is one of the quiet truths that the historian Lillian Schlissel uncovered when she went back and read the actual diaries these women left behind, in her study of women's writing from the overland journey. She found, over and over, that the men set out toward the west, full of hope, leaning forward into the adventure, while the women looked backward, grieving, toward everything they were being made to give up. The men were going toward something. The women were being taken away from something. And those are not the same journey at all, even when they happen in the same wagon. So before there was any prairie, before there was a single mile of trail, there was a morning in a settled place, a town or a farm, somewhere in the east or the Midwest, where a woman stood in a house she had made into a home, and understood that she was about to lose it. Think about what that home actually meant to her. It was not just walls. It was the entire world she had built her life inside. It was the church where she had been married and where her children had been baptized. It was the graveyard where her own parents might be buried, or worse, where one of her own babies might already lie. A small grave she had visited and tended, and was now going to abandon forever, knowing no one would come after her to pull the weeds. It was her mother 3 streets over, or her sisters, the women who had helped her give birth, and who would have helped her again. The web of female hands, that, in that century, was the only thing standing between a woman and the dangers of her own body. All of it, she was going to leave all of it, and here is the part that is almost unbearable when you let yourself feel it. She knew the leaving was permanent. We say goodbye to people now, with the easy assumption that we will see them again. That distance is a temporary inconvenience. There was no such assumption available to her. The journey she was about to make was so long, so expensive, and so dangerous that going back was, for most families, simply not a thing that would ever happen. When she embraced her mother on that last morning, both of them understood, without needing to say it, that this was the final time. She was burying her mother while her mother was still alive. She was attending, in advance, the funerals of everyone she loved and was leaving behind. And then she was expected to dry her face and climb up onto the wagon seat and be cheerful about it, because complaining would not help and there were children watching. What was it that pulled these families west, that was powerful enough to be worth all of this? It is worth understanding, because the dream was real even when it was a lie. There was land out there. Almost unimaginable amounts of it, and for people who had spent their whole lives as tenants, as labourers on other men's farms, as the kind of poor that has no way up and no way out, the idea of owning land of your own, of standing on ground that belonged to you and your children after you, was very close to the idea of becoming a different and freer kind of human being. The advertisements made it sound like paradise. Railroad companies and land speculators and territorial boosters flooded the East with pamphlets and posters painting the West as a garden waiting to be claimed, the soil rich, the rain reliable, the climate kind, the only thing missing being you. Much of it was exaggeration, and a good deal of it was simply false, written by men who would profit when you bought a ticket or a plot, and who would never have to live with the consequences of believing them. But hope is not careful. Hope reads the pamphlet and sees the garden, not the fine print. And so families sold what they had, and packed what they could, and turned their faces toward a place none of them had ever seen, on the strength of a promise, made by strangers who were lying. For the woman, the practical work of leaving fell, as nearly all practical work would for the rest of her life, on her. The men would handle the wagon and the oxen and the route, everything inside the wagon, and everything that would keep a family fed and clothed and alive for the months on the road, and the years on the far side. Of it, that was hers to plan, and the planning was a kind of agony, because the wagon was small, and the journey was long, and almost everything she owned would have to be left behind. Imagine standing in your home and deciding, item by item, what your whole life would be reduced to. The bed your children were born in, too heavy, leave it. The good dishes that came from your grandmother, too fragile. And yet how do you leave your grandmother's dishes? So you wrap them in a quilt, and you pack them, and you tell yourself they will survive, knowing they probably will not. The books. The chair by the window where you nursed your babies. Each object was a small argument between memory and necessity necessity won almost every time, and each surrender was a small grief, stacked on top of the enormous one. By the time the wagon was loaded, a woman had already, in a sense, begun dying out of her old life piece by piece, and she had not yet travelled a single mile. And then came the morning itself. There is a particular cruelty in last mornings, the way they look exactly like ordinary mornings. The sun came up the same as always, the familiar street, the familiar trees, the well she had drawn water from 10,000 times, all of it ordinary, all of it about to be gone. She walked through her emptied house one final time, her footsteps loud now in the bare rooms, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of the place where her life had happened. And then she made herself turn and walk out, and not look back, because looking back would break something she could not afford to have broken. There were embraces that went on too long. There was her mother's face, which she would now have to carry only in memory, and memory, she would learn, fades, no matter how fiercely you try to hold it. Until one day years later, on the prairie, she would realize, with a small private horror, that she could no longer perfectly remember her own mother's face. And there would be no photograph to check it against, and no way ever to see the real thing again. Then she climbed up. The wagon lurched into motion. The town began to slide backward and grow smaller, and she watched it go, the steeple sinking, the rooftops dropping below the rise of the land. Until at last, there was a final moment when she could see the only world she had ever known, and then a moment after that when she could not. And the wagon rolled on into open country, and the door of her old life closed behind her so quietly that the men up front did not even notice it had happened. She noticed. She would carry that closing inside her for the rest of her days. Through everything that was still to come, and everything that was still to come was so much harder than she could possibly have imagined. As she sat there on that first day, dry-eyed and aching, with the dust already rising, and the long road unspooling ahead toward a horizon that did not seem to get any closer no matter how many hours they travelled toward it. Because the leaving, as terrible as it was only the leaving. What waited for her on the road itself would test her in ways that the comfortable story never mentions at all. The trail had a reputation, and the reputation was earned, and it was written, mile after mile, in a long line of graves. The journey west was not a journey in any sense that the word means to us now. It was a slow-motion ordeal that lasted 4 to 6 months, covered roughly 2,000 miles on foot, and asked of an ordinary family a sustained physical endurance that very few people today will ever be called upon to match. And the first thing to understand, the thing that surprises people most, is that almost nobody rode in the wagon. We picture the family riding along inside the covered wagon, swaying pleasantly across the plains. The truth is that the wagon was full. It was packed to its bowed canvas roof, with the supplies that had to last for months, and the few precious possessions that had survived the cutting down, and there was no room in it for passengers, and in any case, the oxen could not have pulled the extra weight. So, the family walked. The woman walked. She walked beside the wagon for hour after hour, day after day, in the same dress, through dust that rose in clouds and worked its way into her eyes and her throat and her hair and the food and everything she owned, or through mud that pulled the shoes off her feet, or through rain that soaked her to the skin with nowhere on earth to get dry. She walked while pregnant, which an enormous number of these women were for much of the journey. She walked carrying an infant, or with small children clinging to her skirts, hurrying them along, watching them constantly, because a child who wandered from the line of wagons could be lost in country that went on forever and looked the same in every direction. She walked 15, 18, 20 miles in a day, and then she stopped, and her work began, because here is the thing the men's version of the trail leaves out. For the men, when the wagons halted for the night, the day's labour was largely done. For the woman, it was only changing shape. She still had to feed everyone. That meant gathering fuel, and on the open plains there was often no wood at all, not a tree in sight in any direction, and so the fuel was dried buffalo dung, gathered off the ground by the armful, the only thing that would burn. And she learned not to think too hard about it, as she built her cooking fire out of it and bent over the smoke. She cooked the same monotonous, difficult food in the same blackened pots, over a fire that the prairie wind kept trying to put out or blow flat. She washed what could be washed, in what little water could be spared. She tended whoever was sick, and someone was almost always sick. She got the children settled, and then at last she lay down on the hard ground, or in the cramped wagon if the weather was bad, for a few hours of sleep that was never enough. And in the dark before dawn it started again, and it kept starting again, every day, for months across a continent. Now lay the danger on top of the labour, because the labour was merely exhausting, and the danger was something else entirely. The thing that killed people on the trail was not what the legend says. The legend says danger came from attacks, from the dramatic confrontations of frontier myth. The reality, documented again and again in the records of these journeys, is that disease killed far, far more travellers than any human enemy ever did. The great killer the one whose name appears over and over in the diaries like a tolling bell, was cholera. Cholera spread through water fouled by human waste, and the trail, with thousands of people and animals moving along the same corridor, drinking from the same rivers and streams, was a near-perfect machine for spreading it. It killed with horrifying speed. A woman could share breakfast with someone who seemed perfectly well, and by evening that person could be dead, having declined through a single brutal day of agony. And there was no treatment, no doctor within hundreds of miles, nothing anyone could do but watch and hold a hand, and then dig. Beyond cholera there was dysentery, and measles, and smallpox, and typhoid, and the vague catch-all the travellers called mountain fever, and any one of them could move through a wagon company and empty it of people while the survivors could move because stopping helped no one, and the season would not wait. This is the part where the Prairie wrote its honest record. And the record was graves. So many graves. The travellers counted them, almost compulsively, in their diaries, as though the counting were a way of bearing witness. One woman, Cecilia Adams, travelling from Illinois to Oregon in the year 1852, kept a running tally of the graves she passed along the way, and by the time she stopped counting the autumn, the number she had recorded was nearly 400. Nearly 400 fresh graves, seen from the seat of one wagon, in one season, on one stretch of one trail, and those were only the ones close enough to the road to be seen and counted. The estimates that historians have made of the total death toll are staggering in a quiet way. On the Oregon Trail alone, it is thought that something like 1 in every 10 or 17 people who set out did not survive the crossing, and that across the full length of the route there lay, on average, a grave roughly every 80 yards. A grave every 80 yards, for 2,000 miles. The trail was, in the most literal sense, a road paved with the dead, and the woman walked it on foot, past grave after grave after grave, knowing that each one had been someone exactly like her, someone who had also stood in a doorway one last morning, and embraced her mother, and believed she was going toward a better life. And then there was the particular danger that belonged to women alone, the one the men did not share, and it was childbirth. Pregnancy did not pause for the journey, and a great many women gave birth on the trail itself, in a wagon, on the ground, under a canvas sheet held up by other women, for the only privacy available in 1,000 miles of open country. There was no rest afterward. This is one of the cruelest facts of the whole undertaking. A woman could deliver a child in the night, and the wagon company, which could not afford to stop, would move on in the morning, and she would move with it, her body torn and bleeding and unhealed, jolting along over rough ground within hours of having given birth. Infection followed birth, the way it always did in that century, and on the trail, with no clean water and no rest and no care, infection after childbirth killed women in large numbers, and it often took the newborn too. Schlissel's reading of the diaries returns again and again to this doubled grief. The woman and the baby lost together, buried together, left behind together, in the same shallow grave, while the wagons rolled on. A husband could lose a wife and a child in a single night, and have no time even to grieve before the demands of the living children, and the moving company pulled him forward. The small graves were the worst. The travellers wrote about those with a grief that comes off the page even now, across all the years. The grave of a child dug beside the trail, sometimes the grave of a newborn who had lived only hours, the little body wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. A blanket, a piece of a dress, sometimes a quilt that the mother had carried all the way from home, and had meant for a bed, and now used instead as a shroud. They covered the small graves with stones, river cobbles carried up from a crossing, to keep the animals from digging, and they marked them when they could with a rough wooden cross, or a board with a name scratched into it, knowing the wind and the weather would erase even that within a season or two. And then the mother had to leave. That is the thing that breaks you when you really sit with it. She had to walk away from her child's grave, into a country she would never be able to find her way back through, knowing with total certainty that she would never stand at that small mound again, that no one ever would, that her child would lie alone out there in the vastness forever, with nothing but stones for company. She had to turn and walk and keep walking, and many of them did this more than once. There were the river crossings, which killed people in their own sudden, violent way, wagons overturning in the current, oxen drowning in their traces, people swept off their feet and gone before anyone could reach them. There were the accidents that came from sheer exhaustion, and the constant proximity of heavy equipment and frightened animals, people crushed beneath wagon wheels, people killed by the accidental discharge of their own guns, children falling under the very wheels that were carrying them west. There was the heat that came off the desert, stretches like the breath of an oven, and the cold that came down out of the high country, and the thirst when the water gave out between sources, when the barrels ran dry, and the next river was a day away, and the children cried for water that simply was not there. And there was the indignity, which sounds small against death, but which ground these women down day after day. There was no privacy. For a woman, in a century that wrapped female modesty in layer upon layer of cloth and shame, the trail was a relentless humiliation. There was nowhere to relieve herself out of sight, nowhere to wash, nowhere to manage the ordinary private functions of a female body, except behind the thin shield of her own skirts, or a blanket held up by another woman. In full view of the open plain, she washed the rags that served as her monthly cloths in the same scarce water everyone drank from, and dried them where she could, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say and no one to say it to who could change it. The diaries are mostly silent on these things, because they were unspeakable then, and that silence is its own kind of testimony to what these women carried without a word. So, picture her now, months into it. She has walked perhaps 1,000 miles. She has buried, let us say, a child, or a sister, or a friend from the wagon company, or all three. She is thinner than she has ever been. Her hands are ruined. Her shoes are coming apart. She has not slept properly in longer than she can remember, and she has not been clean in longer than that. And the woman who stood in the doorway of her old home on that last bright morning is becoming someone else, someone harder and quieter and more hollowed out. A person being slowly carved down to the essential business of survival, and still the horizon does not change. Still the wagon rolls. Still there is no going back. And then, after all of it, after the months and the graves and the river and the thirst, the wagon finally stops in some empty place that the men declare to be the destination, and she climbs down, and she looks around at the land that all of this was supposedly for, the land that was going to be the garden in the pamphlet, the reward at the end of the suffering. And there is nothing there. No house, no town, no neighbours, no shelter of any kind, just grass and wind, and a piece of empty ground, and the staggering sinking understanding that the journey was not the hard part. The journey was the easy part, because now she was expected to build a life, from absolutely nothing, in a place that did not want her there, and the first thing she would have to build, before winter came, was something to keep her family alive. She would have to build a house, and the only material she had to build it from was the dirt under her feet. There is a law at the centre of this story, and it is worth knowing its name, because that law shaped the lives of more American women than almost any other single thing in the 19th century. It was called the Homestead Act, and it was signed in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, and on paper it was one of the most generous offers a government has ever made to ordinary people. It said, in essence, this: any citizen, or any person intending to become one, could claim 160 acres of public land in the West. The land was, for all practical purposes, free. There was only one real condition, and the condition was the whole catch. You had to live on that land, and farm it and improve it, and stay there for 5 continuous years. If you did that, the 160 acres became yours forever. If you broke before the 5 years were up, you got nothing. It sounds like a gift. To the family standing in the empty grass at the end of the trail, it was a gift wrapped around a blade, because the words on the document, live on it, and improve it for 5 years, contained inside them every hardship this chapter is about to describe. And most of that hardship would fall on the woman. And here is the figure that tells you the truth of it. The figure that should be remembered whenever anyone speaks romantically about the homesteading dream. Of all the families who took up the offer, who claimed their land and built their first rough shelter and set out to last the 5 years, fewer than half succeeded. More than half failed. More than half of these families, after everything, after the leaving and the trail and the graves, were beaten by the land itself and walked away with nothing. The Prairie kept a tally, and it was a brutal one. But on the first day, none of that was decided yet. On the first day there was only the empty claim, and the coming winter, and the absolute necessity of shelter. And so the family began to build, and what they built tells you everything about how alone and how unequipped they truly were. Because on much of the Great Plains there was no wood, We forget this. We picture the log cabin, snug and wooden, but the log cabin belonged to the forested country, and out on the open grassland there were no forests, sometimes not a single tree for miles in any direction, nothing to cut, nothing to build with, nothing at all but grass and sky and the dirt underneath. So the settlers built with the dirt. They built their houses out of the ground. The first shelter was often the most primitive kind, the one called a dugout, and it was exactly what the name says. The family found a low rise or the bank of a creek, and they dug a hole into the side of it, a cave really, and they faced the open side with whatever they had. A few precious boards if they could get them, or more sod, and they put a roof of branches and grass and packed earth over the top, and that was the house. A hole in a hill, the woman who had kept a proper home back east, with real floors and glass windows, and a door that closed against the world, now lived in a burrow dug into the dirt. Digging was punishing labour, so the dugouts were small. They were dark, lit by a single small opening if that. They were almost impossible to keep dry, because they were cut into the earth, and the groundwater seeped through the walls and the floor. And when it rained the roof leaked mud, actual mud, dripping down onto the beds and the table and the food. And they were not empty of other tenants. Snakes found their way in through the earthen walls, and so did insects, and a woman learned to check the bedding and to keep one eye always moving in the place where she was raising her children. If the family lasted and prospered even a little, they graduated from the dugout to the thing that has become the symbol of this whole era, the sod house, the soddy. And the soddy was a genuine achievement, a real house built entirely from the prairie, and it deserves a kind of respect, even as we tell the truth about what it was like to live in. To build one, the settlers took a special plough and cut the tough, root-bound prairie sod into long strips, and then chopped the strips into bricks, heavy wet bricks of grass and soil and tangled roots, and they stacked these bricks like masonry into walls, grass side down, layer upon layer, until they had raised up 4 walls of solid earth. They laid a framework of whatever poles they could find or buy across the top, and covered it with more sod, and there was the roof. The walls were enormously thick, 2 or 3 feet of packed earth, and this thickness was the soddy's great virtue. It made the house remarkably sturdy. It made it nearly fireproof, which mattered enormously on a grassland, where wildfire could come racing across the plain, faster than a person could run. And it made the house cool through the blistering prairie summers, and warm through the murderous prairie winters, far warmer than the flimsy wooden shacks that some settlers threw up, because earth holds its temperature the way nothing else available to them could. That is the fair and honest praise the sod house has earned. Now here is what it was actually like to keep a home and raise children inside. One, which is the part the museum displays tend to leave out. It was made of dirt, and so it was never, ever clean. This is the thing that wore at the women more than almost anything else about the soddy, because cleanliness was not a small matter to them. It was tied up with their entire sense of decency and self-respect, and the kind of mother and wife they believed themselves to be, and the sod house made cleanliness impossible. The walls shed a fine, constant dust. The ceiling, that roof of packed sod, dropped a steady, gentle rain of dirt and crumbs of earth down onto everything, onto the table while the family ate, onto the bed while they slept, into the cooking pot, into the baby's cradle. After a heavy rain the roof might leak for days, long after the storm had passed, dripping muddy water onto the floor and the furniture. And there are accounts of women cooking with an umbrella held over the stove and eating dinner with one held over the table. The floor was usually bare earth, swept smooth and hard, sometimes packed down with a coating that helped, but earth nonetheless, and you cannot truly clean a dirt floor, you can only manage it. The woman swept and dusted and wiped and fought the dirt every single day, and every single day the dirt won, because the dirt was not in the house. The dirt was the house, and there was something quietly demoralizing in that, in the daily losing battle to keep a home decent, when the home itself was made of the very thing she was trying to keep out. The space was tiny, and a whole family lived in it. A typical sod house was a single room, something like 16 feet by 20, and into that one small room went everything, the cooking and the eating and the sleeping and the washing and the sickness and the births and the whole of a family's life. There was little room for furniture, so the furniture was improvised. Beds and shelves, built right into the earthen walls, pallets on the floor that were rolled out at night and stacked away by day to make room to move. Privacy did not exist. A husband and wife, parents and children, the well and the sick, all of it unfolded in the same dim, crowded, earth-walled room. And when a new baby came, it came there, behind a hung sheet at best, with the children shooed outside, if the weather allowed, and present in the same room if it did not. And the light. We have lost any real sense of how dark the past was, and the sod house was very dark. Windows were costly, because glass had to be hauled in across all that distance, and walls that thick did not let light travel far in any case, so a soddy might have one small window, or two, or in the case of a dugout sometimes none at all. Inside, even at midday, it was dim. At night it was lit by a single small flame, a candle the woman had made herself from animal fat, or a lamp burning oil that had to be bought, and was therefore used as sparingly as possible. And so the evenings were spent in a deep gloom, the family gathered close to one weak point of light, the corners of the room lost in shadow, the long dark hours of a prairie winter night stretching out around them. Now, I want to be fair to these women, and to be fair to them is to tell you that they fought back against all of this, and the way they fought back is one of the most human and moving details in the whole story. They tried to make these holes in the ground into homes. They could not change the dirt walls, so they whitewashed them when they could afford the lime, or pasted old newspapers over them, or in better days hung wallpaper, anything to cover the bare earth and make it look a little more like the homes they had left. They put up curtains, even small ones, even made from a flour sack, at the one little window, because a curtain was a declaration that this was a home and not a cave. They set out the few treasures that had survived the trail, the grandmother's dishes if they had lived, a clock, a framed picture, a single fine thing placed where the eye would land on it. And the most touching detail of all, the one that I think tells you the whole truth about the spirit of these women, is what some of them did with the roof. The roof was made of sod, of living prairie grass and earth, and so in the springtime things grew out of it, and rather than fight this, some women leaned into it and scattered the seeds of wildflowers up on top of their houses, so that in the spring their roofs would bloom, so that they would live under a ceiling of flowers. Think about that. A woman so far from beauty, so surrounded by hardship and dirt and grinding work, that she planted a garden on her roof, because she could not bear a life with no flowers in it, and the roof was the one place the cattle could not eat them. That is not weakness. That is one of the bravest things I have ever heard of. There is one example of this kind of home that you may already know without realizing it, and it sits right at the edge of our story. Long before she was famous, a girl named Laura Ingalls lived for a time with her family in a dugout, cut into the bank of a creek in Minnesota, a home made exactly this way, of earth and grass. The kind of place where you could stand on the roof, without quite knowing you were standing on someone's house. That family was real, and that dugout was real, and the gentle, golden way their life was later remembered in famous stories is precisely the comfortable version we have been setting aside tonight, because for every detail those beloved tales kept, they softened a dozen others. And the earth-walled house in the creek bank was, for the real women who lived in such places, a far harder home than any story has ever quite admitted. So, this was the shelter. This was the great prize at the end of the trail, the thing the leaving and the dying had all been for, a single dark room made of dirt on an empty piece of grass under an enormous sky. And a woman stood in it, on the first night, and listened to the wind find the walls, and understood that this was now her entire world, and that she was going to have to make a life inside it. But a house, even a house of earth, is only walls. It does not feed anyone, it does not clothe anyone, it does not keep the fire burning, or the water flowing, or the children fed and washed and alive. All of that, every bit of it, in a place with no stores and no help, and no machinery, and no mercy, would have to be made by hand, her hand, from raw materials and sheer labour, in a working day that began before the sun came up, and did not truly end until she fell unconscious from exhaustion. The house was finished. The work, the real work, the work that would consume the rest of her life, was only about to begin. To understand a frontier woman's day, you have to first let go of an idea so basic that you have probably never once questioned it. You have to let go of the idea that things come ready-made. Nearly everything we use simply exists for us, finished, waiting to be bought or switched on or taken down from a shelf. For her, almost nothing existed until she made it. The soap did not exist until she made the soap. The candle did not exist until she made the candle. The bread did not exist. The butter did not exist. The cloth her family's clothes were cut from did not exist. The clean water in the house did not exist. None of it existed until her two hands brought it into being out of raw material and fire and time. Her life was not a life of using things. It was a life of manufacturing, from scratch, every single day, all the ordinary substances of survival, and the manufacturing never stopped because the family kept eating and wearing out and getting dirty and needing more. And so the work simply renewed itself forever, like a tide that came in every morning, no matter how hard she had bailed against it the day before. Her day began in the dark. There was no choosing to sleep in, because the first task of the morning was the fire, and the fire was the beating heart of the whole household, and it could not be allowed to die. Everything depended on it. There was no cooking without it, no warmth without it, no hot water for anything without it, and starting a fire from nothing, from cold, with the tools she had, was slow and miserable work, and so the real art was never letting it go out in the first place. She banked the coals carefully every night, and she woke before everyone to coax them back to flame every morning, and on the days the fire died despite her, on a bitter morning with the kindling damp, the failure could cost an hour of frozen fumbling effort before the family could so much as warm their hands. And feeding that fire was its own endless problem, because, as we have seen, on the treeless plains there was often no wood, so the fuel was whatever would burn. It was dried cow and buffalo dung, gathered off the prairie and stacked like fuel because it was fuel. It was twisted hay, which the family learned to wind into tight, hard knots that would burn slowly, an entire evening's labour, sometimes going just to twist enough grass to keep the stove alive through one cold night. Whatever it was, gathering it and preparing it was constant, and much of it fell to her and to the children. With the fire lit, the water, there was no water in the house, because there was no well in the house, and frequently no well at all yet, and so water came from a creek, or a spring, or a distant hand-dug well, and it had to be carried, bucket by heavy bucket, in from wherever it was to wherever she needed it. And she needed it constantly, for cooking, for washing the dishes and the children and herself, for the animals, for the great periodic ordeals of laundry and bathing. Water is astonishingly heavy, and a household goes through an astonishing amount of it, and every drop of it she had first carried, on foot, often a fair distance, often through mud or snow, often while pregnant or with a baby on her hip. The simple act of having water in the house, which costs us a turn of the wrist and not a thought, cost her a meaningful portion of her physical strength every single day of her life. Then came the daily, unending business of food, and at the centre of it stood bread, because bread was what these families largely lived on, and bread was not bought, it was made, and making it well was a real skill that took years to master and hours to perform. She ground, or measured the flour, she worked the dough, she managed the temperamental rise of it, and then she baked it. In an oven that was nothing like an oven we would recognise, a cast-iron contraption, or a hole in the side of the stove, with no dial, no temperature, no timer, nothing but her own judgment of the heat, learned through long experience and many ruined loaves, gauged by holding her hand in the oven and counting, or by watching the colour of the flame. And bread was only the foundation. There was everything else to be coaxed out of the few ingredients she had. There was the garden, which was her responsibility, a patch of vegetables wrestled out of the tough ground and defended against the sun and the wind and the grasshoppers and the wandering animals, and the garden's whole purpose was the long work of preserving, because the prairie winter was long, and nothing grew in it, and so the family ate in winter only what she had managed to put up in the warmer months. She canned, she dried, she salted. After an animal was butchered, she salted and smoked, and stored the meat to make it last, racing against spoilage with no way to keep anything cold. She churned the cream into butter, standing over the churn, working the dash up and down, for the better part of an hour, to produce a single batch. She made the cheese. She gathered the eggs. She milked the cows in the dark before the day had even properly started. The food on the table was not a meal. It was the visible end of a chain of labour that ran back through every season of the year. And then there was wash day, and wash day deserves its own telling. Because of all the recurring labours of a woman's week, laundry was the one that the women themselves seem most to have dreaded, and when you understand what it actually involved, you will understand why. It was not an afternoon's chore. It was very nearly a 2-day war, fought once a week, traditionally beginning on a Monday, so that everything might be clean and pressed again by the following Sunday. It began, like everything, with water, enormous quantities of it, hauled in and heated to boiling in great kettles over a fire that had to be kept roaring hot for hours. The soap was shaved into the water. The clothes were sorted by colour and by filth, the whites and the least dirty things washed first, while the water was cleanest, then the darker things, then last of all the heaviest, foulest work garments, ground with sweat and soil. Each piece had to be soaked and then scrubbed, and the scrubbing was the brutal heart of it. Hour upon hour bent double over a tub, working each garment up and down against the rough ridges of a washboard, the harsh homemade soap and the hot water cracking and reddening her hands, her back bent in the same aching curve until she could barely straighten it. Then the boiling, then the rinsing, then the wringing, every single piece twisted by hand with all her strength to force the water out, and then the hanging, and then, the next day, the ironing, with heavy flat irons heated on the stove, swapped out as they cooled, pressed across the dampened cloth. An entire week's clothing for a whole family, washed and wrung and dried and pressed, by one woman, with her hands, in water she had carried and heated herself, using soap she had made herself. And then the week turned over, and it was Monday again. Because, of course, she had made the soap too. I have mentioned this, but it is worth standing inside the making of it for a moment, because it captures the sheer brutal physicality of this woman's competence. Soap was made from two things she produced or saved on the farm, animal fat and lye, and the lye she leached herself out of wood ashes and water, a caustic, dangerous liquid strong enough to burn skin. She combined the fat and the lye in a great kettle, and she cooked it for hours, stirring, over a fire, and the fumes that came off that cauldron were foul and stinging, and made the eyes stream, and the balance had to be exactly right, because too much lye and the soap would burn the skin it was meant to clean, and too little, and it would not clean at all, and she judged that balance by feel and by experience, standing over a steaming kettle of caustic grease in the heat, hour after hour, to produce the humble bars that her family's entire cleanliness depended on. There was no other source for it. If she did not stand over that kettle, there was no soap. And she made the light. The candles that pushed back, however feebly, against the enormous prairie dark were tallow candles, and tallow is rendered animal fat, and rendering it was another long, hot, smelly labour, melting down the fat and clarifying it, and then dipping the wicks again and again and again, building each candle up in thin, patient layers, or pouring the fat into moulds and waiting, to produce a supply of candles that would be burned through and need making again. Light itself, the simple ability to see in the dark, was something she manufactured with her hands out of the fat of slaughtered animals. I have not even reached the clothing yet, and the clothing was a world of labour unto itself. In the earlier and poorer years especially, a woman did not buy cloth, she made it, beginning with raw wool or flax, carding it and spinning it into thread or yarn on a wheel, then weaving the yarn into actual fabric, and only then cutting and sewing that fabric into garments, all by hand, by the light she had made, in the hours left after everything else. And clothes in that life did not get replaced, they got mended, endlessly, patched and repatched, and turned and handed down. Every tear her responsibility, every popped seam, every worn elbow and frayed hem, the same small needle going in and out by firelight, night after the children were finally asleep, because the mending was the kind of work you did in the scraps of time that were left, and for a frontier woman, there were only ever scraps of time left. Now hold all of this in your mind at once, because that is the only way to see the truth of it. The fire, and the war, and the bread, and the garden, and the canning, and the churning, and the milking, and the washing, and the soap, and the candles, and the spinning, and the sewing, and the mending, and woven all the way through it, underneath all of it, never pausing for any of it, the children. The constant care and watching and feeding and teaching and nursing of children, often many of them, often including a baby at the breast and another not yet able to walk, all of them needing her, all of them in danger in 100 small ways in a place with no safety anywhere. She did not do these tasks one at a time in any case. She did them all at once, all day, every day, the bread rising while the baby cried, while the wash boiled, while a child needed watching near the fire, while the light was failing, and the mending waited. And when the men needed help in the fields at planting or at harvest, when the survival of the whole farm hung on getting the crop in, she did that too, on top of everything else, leaving the housework undone, or doing it in the dark, at either end of the day. There is a reason this kind of labour does not appear in the comfortable story. And the reason is that there is nothing dramatic about it. It is not a battle or an adventure. It is just work, the same work forever. And that very relentlessness is what made it so crushing, and what makes it so easy to overlook. No single day of it would break a person. It was the accumulation that broke them. The sheer endless repetition, day after day after day, with no rest, no holiday, no sick leave, no afternoon that belonged to her. The work simply continuing for as long as she was able to stand, and resuming the moment she could stand again. We honor soldiers for enduring hardship for the length of a campaign. These women endured this for the length of lives. And the terrible thing, the thing this chapter has been walking toward, is that all of this, the whole staggering edifice of labor, was the easy part. It was the part she could control, the part that responded to effort, the part where working harder actually helped. There was another whole dimension of this life, where working harder helped not at all, where she was utterly powerless, where the prairie took what it wanted, and there was nothing her competent, exhausted hands could do to stop it. The land could give, and the land could take, and when it chose to take, it could erase an entire year of her labor between one sunrise and the next. And there was one year above all that the people of the plains would never stop talking about. The year the light went out of the sky in the middle of the day, and the sky itself came down to eat the world. Everything, in the end, rested on the crop. This is the thing that gave frontier life its terrible precariousness, the fact underneath all the other facts. A family could survive the trail, build the house, endure the labor, and all of it depended, every year, on a single fragile gamble, the harvest, the crop in the field that would either feed them through the winter and be sold for the few dollars, that bought everything they could not make, or would fail, and leave them facing the cold with empty hands. The woman poured her labor into that crop alongside the man, the garden, especially being hers, and she watched it through the season the way a mother watches a sick child, because she understood that those green rows standing in the sun were not really plants at all. They were survival itself, made visible, growing in the dirt, and the prairie had 100 ways to destroy them. The most famous of these, the one that became a kind of legend of horror across the whole Great Plains, came in the summer of 1874, and it is worth telling in full because there is nothing else quite like it in the story of this country. That summer had been hot and dry, a drought summer, the kind of weather that the settlers had already learned to dread. And then, on certain days across an enormous stretch of the plains, from Texas up through Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, and into Minnesota and Iowa, people working in their fields looked up and saw something strange on the horizon. A shimmer, a glittering cloud, low in the sky, coming toward them, and at first some of them hoped it might be rain. It was not rain. As it drew closer, the cloud began to hum, and then to roar, a sound made of millions upon millions of wings, and the light began to dim as the thing blotted out the sun, and then it came down. It was grasshoppers. The Rocky Mountain locust, in numbers that the human mind genuinely cannot hold, descending out of the sky onto the land in a living, crawling, devouring blanket. What followed was like something out of scripture. The locusts covered everything. They came down so thick that they piled up over a foot deep on the ground, so thick that they broke the limbs of trees with their weight, so thick that the records say train wheels lost, their grip on rails, made slick with their crushed bodies, and they ate. They ate the crops down to the bare earth in a matter of hours, an entire field of wheat or corn, a whole season of labor, gone between morning and evening. They stripped the gardens, the family's winter food, to nothing, and when the green was gone they kept eating, because there were too many of them, and not enough world, and they ate things that should have been safe. They ate the wool, right off the backs of living sheep. They ate the leather harnesses off the horses. They gnawed the wooden handles of tools. They ate the curtains at the windows and the clothing off the line, and in some cases pushed into the houses themselves, and ate the food on the table. The settlers had a bitter joke about it afterward, that the grasshoppers ate everything but the mortgage, and their waste and their dead bodies fouled the wells and the streams, so that even the water was spoiled. A woman could stand in her doorway and watch, completely powerless, while a year of her life and her family's entire margin of survival was consumed in front of her by an insect, the sky still dark with them, the sound of their feeding everywhere, and nothing at all, that she could do. The plague returned the following year, in 1875, in the event that came to be called Albert's Swarm, after a Nebraska physician and amateur weather watcher named Albert Child who tried to grasp the scale of what was passing over him by timing how long the swarm took to cross the sky above southern Nebraska, and multiplying it out. The number he arrived at described a single swarm covering something on the order of nearly 200,000 square miles, a swarm a mile high that took 5 full days to pass overhead, and it is remembered to this day as very likely the largest gathering of living creatures ever recorded on the face of the earth. Think of that, the largest assembly of animals in the known history of the planet, and it descended directly onto the homes of these families and ate their world. In the aftermath, there was real starvation and real ruin across the plains, families broken and driven off entirely, and such was the desperation that aid had to be sent, food and clothing and seed grain, and the government even relaxed the rules of the homestead claims, so that ruined farmers could leave their land temporarily to seek help without forfeiting everything. There is a quiet echo of this catastrophe, sitting inside one of the gentlest stories this country has ever loved. A swarm of these same locusts came down on southwestern Minnesota in the summer of 1874, the very season a particular family had just settled on the banks of a creek called Plum Creek. And the little girl of that family, grown old, would one day write that disaster into a beloved children's book about her prairie childhood. Generations of us read that story, or had it read to us, as a sweet adventure, a bit of old-fashioned hardship safely wrapped in coziness, and a happy ending. It was in fact this: the darkened sky, the devoured crop, the ruin. The gentle telling kept the grasshoppers, and softened nearly everything around them, the way the gentle telling always did, and most of us never knew that the charming episode in the storybook was a real family, watching real starvation crawl up out of the ground. The locusts were the most spectacular destroyer, but they were not the only one. There was fire. On the dry grassland, a prairie fire could be born from a lightning strike or a stray spark, and once it caught, it ran. A wall of flame moving across the open country faster than a person could flee, pushed by the endless wind, and a family might look up to see a line of smoke and fire on the horizon, bearing down on everything they had built. They fought it by ploughing strips of bare earth as fire breaks, by setting backfires, by beating at the flames with wet sacks, and sometimes they won, and sometimes they lost the crop, the animals, the haystacks, everything but the earthen house that would not burn. And there was the slower disaster, the drought itself. The years the rain simply did not come, when the families had been lured west in part by a comforting lie that was popular in those days, the notion that the act of ploughing and settling the land would somehow draw the rains. That rain would follow the plough. It did not follow the plough. The rain came, or it did not according to its own indifferent logic. And in the dry years the crops withered in the field, and there was nothing growing to feed anyone, and the woman watched the sky for clouds that never came. This was the deepest cruelty of the farming life, deeper in some ways than the labour, because labour at least rewarded effort. Here, effort meant nothing. A woman could do everything right, work without rest, plant and tend and pray, and still lose all of it in an afternoon to an insect or a flame or a cloudless sky, through no fault and no failing of her own, and then face the winter with empty hands, and begin again. If she could begin again at all. It taught a particular kind of humility, and a particular kind of grief. The grief of the powerless before forces were too large to fight, and yet a crop, however bitterly, could be planted again the next spring. A house could be rebuilt. Even a ruined family could sometimes start over. There were losses on the frontier that worked this way, that could be borne and recovered from, and the disasters of the field, terrible as they were, belonged mostly to that kind. But there was another kind of loss waiting for her, the kind that no spring could undo, and no labour could repair, and no aid could replace. And it did not come for her fields. It came for the living. It reached, in the end, past everything else, for her own body and for her children. There is a grim little saying that has come down to us from the women of the plains. 3 short phrases that contain an entire life, and it went like this: one in the crib, one on the breast, and one on the way. Say it slowly, and you can feel the whole shape of a frontier woman's body years pressing out from inside it. One child just past infancy, sleeping in the cradle. One child still nursing at her body, and another child already growing inside her, already on its way. This was not unusual. This was simply what a married woman's life on the frontier was, year after year, a more or less continuous cycle of pregnancy and birth and nursing and pregnancy again, often 8 or 10 or 12 times across her childbearing years. Her body never once given the chance to fully recover. before it was called upon to do the whole enormous thing over again. We have to be honest about what childbirth meant in that century, because we have grown so used to it being safe that we have forgotten it was, for most of human history, one of the most dangerous things a woman would ever do, and on the frontier, it was more dangerous still. Birth was attended, when a woman was lucky, by other women, by a neighbour who had done it herself, by a local woman with a reputation for steady hands, by her own mother or sister, if by some mercy any of them were near, though we have already seen how many of these women had left their mothers and sisters 1,000 miles behind. There were no hospitals. There was, across vast stretches of the plains, no doctor within any reachable distance, and even when one could in theory be sent for, the sending took a day's hard ride out, and a day's hard ride back, and a birth that goes wrong does not wait 2 days. So a great many frontier women gave birth with only another woman or two beside them, and some gave birth with no one at all, alone in a sod house with the wind outside, and the older children sent out or shushed into a corner, doing the most perilous work of human life entirely by themselves. There was nothing to ease it. There was no relief from the pain, none. The woman went through the whole of it, on nothing but her own endurance. And when something went wrong, and across that many births, something went wrong often, there was very little anyone present could do. If the labour stalled, if the child was turned the wrong way, if the bleeding would not stop afterward, the women in that room reached the limit of what was possible very quickly, and then they could only do what people in that century so often had to do, which was to wait and pray and watch. And then there was the thing that came after, the silent killer that haunted childbirth everywhere in those years, the infection they called childbed fever, which could take a woman who had come through the birth itself perfectly well, who had held her new baby and believed the danger was past, and kill her over the following days through nothing more than the dirt and the lack of any understanding of how infection spread. A husband could watch his wife deliver a healthy child, and then watch her die of fever a week later, and be left standing in a sod house, with a newborn he had no idea how to feed, and a clutch of other children, and a farm that still demanded everything. And that scene, that exact scene, played out across the plains more times than anyone ever counted. But suppose she lived, suppose she came through it, as most did, time after time, her body absorbing the toll. Then the danger simply transferred to the child, because surviving the birth was only the first gate, and the gates that followed were just as deadly. And this is the part of the story that is almost too heavy to carry, and yet it is the truest part, and it is the part the comfortable version works hardest to hide. Children died on the frontier. They died in numbers that we, who expect our children to live, can barely make ourselves comprehend. They died as newborns, and they died as toddlers, and they died as half-grown children, and they died of things that today we would barely think about: a fever, a cough that settled into the lungs, a stomach sickness that drained a small body of its water faster than it could be replaced, an infection in a cut, the ordinary illnesses of childhood that now we treat without a second thought, and that then, out there, with no doctor and no medicine and no help within a day's ride, simply ran their course, and the course often ended in a small grave. And the isolation, the very thing that defined frontier life, was what made it lethal. We touched on this, but here is where it cuts the deepest. When a child fell sick in the night with a high fever, the nearest help might be 10 miles away, or 20, or further, and there might be no one home there in any case. And so the parents were alone with it. They were alone with a burning, struggling child, and no knowledge, and no medicine, and no one to send for, and nothing to do but hold the small body through the dark, and try everything they could think of. The cool cloths, the desperate folk remedies, the prayers, and watch none of it work. Many a frontier mother sat up through an entire night with a dying child in her arms, in a one-room house made of earth, with the wind going outside, completely powerless, and felt the small weight in her arms go still before morning. And then, because there was no one else to do it, the family buried their own child themselves, on their own land, often within sight of the house, in a grave the father dug and the mother lined with the best cloth she had, and they marked it, and the mother went back inside, and there was a fire to be lit, and other children to be fed, and water to be carried, and the work, the merciless work, did not pause for her grief by even a single hour. She had to keep going. There was no other option available to her in the entire universe. She had to bury her child in the morning, and bake bread in the afternoon, because the living also needed to eat, and so she did, and she carried that grave inside her for the rest of her life, and very rarely spoke of it. And there are countless women resting now in prairie cemeteries who buried 2 children, or 3, or more, out on those claims, and whose endurance in the face of that is something I do not have adequate words for. Some of those small graves are gone now entirely. This is one of the quietest sorrows of the whole story. A child buried on a homestead 150 years ago, marked with a wooden cross or a board, lay in a grave that the family tended faithfully for as long as they lived there. But more than half of these families, remember, did not last. They failed, and they left, and they moved on, and the grave of the child was left behind on land that passed to strangers, and the wooden marker rotted, and the prairie grass grew over the small mound, and the plough eventually came. And today there are children of the frontier lying in unmarked, unknown, unfindable graves beneath fields of wheat and corn, all across the middle of this country, their names lost, their mother's grief lost, everything about them lost, except the single fact that they were here, and they were loved, and they died, and someone had to walk away from them. And through all of it, birth after birth, loss after loss, year after year of the unending labour, her own body was paying its own price, and this is the last hard truth of this chapter. The frontier aged its women with terrible speed. The combination was merciless, the relentless physical work that never stopped, the many pregnancies that drained her, the poor and monotonous diet in the lean years, the sun and the wind and the cold that weathered her skin, the sleep she never got enough of, the grief that wore at her from the inside. It all added up, and it added up fast, and it showed. There are photographs of these women, and accounts written by travellers who met them, and the thing that comes through again and again is how old the young women looked. A woman of 40 on the frontier could carry the body and the face of someone I would take for 60 or 70. Her hands were ruined by the lie and the labour. Her back was bent from the washboard and the carrying and the fields. Her teeth, with no care available, were often gone or going. The bloom that she had worn on that last bright morning back east, the young wife climbing onto the wagon, was used up, spent, poured out into the land and the children and the work, and what was left was something leaner and harder and older than her years, a woman worn down to gristle and will. She did not complain, mostly, because there was no one to complain to, and nothing complaining would change. And because the women around her were all enduring the same thing, and stoicism was simply the air they all breathed. But do not mistake that silence for the absence of suffering. The suffering was enormous. It was simply borne without witness, swallowed down, folded away inside, and that swallowing, that endless requirement to absorb pain and loss and exhaustion with no outlet and no relief, and no one to truly share it with, was itself a kind of slow wound. The body paid in visible ways, in the bent back and the ruined hands and the aged face. But there was another part of her that was also being asked to bear, more than a human being can bear, year after year, in almost complete isolation, and that part did not show up in any photograph. That part was the mind. And out on the silent, endless, wind-haunted plains, there were women whose minds, under the weight of all of it, finally began to give way. We have spoken of the body, of what the work and the births and the losses did to a woman's flesh and frame. But there was another kind of damage out on the plains, quieter and harder to see, and in some ways more frightening, because it could not be bandaged or rested or buried and grieved. It happened inside, it happened in the mind, and it was common enough on the frontier that the people of the time gave it a name. They called it prairie fever, they called it prairie madness, and it was real, and it was widespread, and it fell most heavily of all upon the women. To understand how a sane, capable woman could be slowly driven out of her own mind, you have to first understand the specific quality of frontier isolation, because it was unlike anything most people will ever experience. And it was unlike anything these women had known in their old lives. We have talked about distance, but distance alone does not capture it. Picture the actual geography of a homestead. The claim was 160 acres, and the next family's claim might be a mile away, or 2 or 5, and the nearest town, the nearest place with other people, and a store and a church, might be 10 or 20 miles off, a journey of most of a day. And then add the central fact of the arrangement, the one that decided everything. The man went to town. When supplies were needed, when business had to be done, when there was contact to be had with the wider world, it was the husband who hitched the wagon and made the long ride, and it was the wife who stayed. She stayed because someone had to mind the children and the animals, and the fire and the home, and so she remained behind on the claim, sometimes for a full day, sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, entirely alone with small children, in a single room made of earth, with nothing around her in any direction but grass and sky and the wind. And the loneliness this produced was not the ordinary loneliness of missing company. It was something deeper and more corrosive, a total absence of the thing human beings are built to need, which is other people. She might go days without seeing another adult. She might go weeks without speaking to another woman. The whole web of female companionship that had held up her life back east, the mothers and sisters and neighbours and friends, the casual daily talk over a fence or after church, all of it was simply gone, replaced by a silence so complete that it became a presence in itself. There was no one to talk to. There was no one to share the work or the worry. There was no one who understood. And when something went wrong, when the baby was sick, or the fear came in the night, or the grief rose up, she faced it alone, and she faced it alone again the next time, and the aloneness accumulated inside her like water rising in a closed room. Then there was the land itself, and the strange psychological weight of it, which the settlers spoke about often, and which is hard to convey to anyone who has not stood in the middle of it. The Great Plains were flat, and treeless, and vast beyond reckoning, and they were the same in every direction as far as the eye could reach, and far beyond. There was nothing to rest the eye on. No hill, no forest, no landmark, nothing but the enormous flat circle of the horizon, identical to the north and the south, and the east and the west, and the immense empty bowl of the sky pressing down on top of it. For people who had come from green, enclosed, varied country, from places with woods and hills and towns, this monotonous infinity did something to the mind over time. It made some people feel unbearably small and exposed, a single speck under all that sky. It made others feel a creeping sense of being trapped, paradoxically, in all that openness, as though the very limitlessness of the place were a cage with walls too far away to see. A writer of the period named Eugene Smalley, who studied this affliction and wrote about it in an essay in 1893 on the isolation of prairie farms, described the way the treeless plains stretched away identical mile after identical mile, inspiring in its summer colour, and yet, when the snow came and covered everything, bleak and dispiriting beyond words, with no birds, no sound, nothing but a silence he compared to death, broken only by the cruelty of the wind. The wind. We come back to the wind, because the settlers came back to it, because it was the one thing on the plains that never, ever stopped, and over time it became, for many women, the very voice of their suffering. The prairie wind blew constantly, day and night, week upon week, a ceaseless pressure and a ceaseless sound, sighing and moaning around the corners of the sod house, rattling whatever could rattle, pushing endlessly against the walls and the mind. And there is something about a sound that never stops. When you are already exhausted and isolated and frightened, that begins to work its way into you. Women came to dread it. Some came to hate it with an intensity that startled them. And some, in the worst cases, began to hear things in it, voices in the wind, words almost forming and never quite forming, the auditory edge of a mind starting to come apart under the strain of too much solitude and too much sound, and not enough rest and not enough hope. The diaries and letters that survive from the 1870s and 1880s record exactly this. Settlers describing the wind as a kind of torment, describing the way, the endless noise and the endless silence underneath it began to erode something essential in them. So, what did prairie madness actually look like when it took hold of a woman? It did not usually announce itself dramatically. It came on slowly, the way a long erosion does. The accounts describe a gradual change in a woman who had been steady and competent. She would grow quiet, and then quieter, withdrawing into herself, speaking less and less, even on the rare occasions when there was someone to speak to. She might begin to weep without clear cause, the tears simply coming and not stopping. She might stop caring for her appearance, stop keeping herself the way she always had, a small surrender that the people around her learned to read as a warning sign. She might become irritable, or fearful, or strange, her character seeming to shift into something her family did not recognize. There could be a creeping paranoia, a sense of threat with no object, and in the most severe cases, the accounts grow truly dark, describing episodes of breakdown, of violence, and sometimes of a woman taking her own life out there in the isolation, driven past the edge of what she could bear, by the accumulated weight of all of it. I want to be careful and honest here, the way these women deserve, and so I have to tell you something about the numbers, which is that there really are no reliable numbers. People of the time had the strong impression that Prairie madness struck women harder than men, and that when it ended in the worst way, it ended that way more often for women, and that impression appears again and again in the writing of the period. But no one was truly counting. There were no records being kept of the mental suffering of isolated farm wives, no studies, no statistics worth the name, because the inner lives of these women were not the kind of thing the world bothered to measure. So, what we have is the testimony, the diaries and the letters and the recollections, and the testimony is consistent, and it points clearly to a real and widespread phenomenon, even if we will never have a precise count of how many minds the Prairie quietly broke. The absence of numbers is itself part of the story. It is one more way these women were uncounted. And here is the cruelest fold in the whole thing, the part that makes it so hard to see even now. These women, very often, hid it. They hid it the same way they hid every other kind of suffering, by swallowing it, by keeping up appearances, by writing cheerful letters home. Think about the woman alone in her soddy, frightened, lonely past description, feeling something coming loose inside her. And then think about her sitting down in the rare quiet moment to write a letter to her mother far away in the East. What did she write? Overwhelmingly, she wrote that all was well. She wrote that they were managing, that the children were growing, that the crop looked promising, that she was content. She did not write the truth. Oh, partly because the truth would only frighten and grieve a mother who could do nothing to help, and partly because admitting it even on paper might make it more real than she could survive. And so, the historical record is full of these calm, brave, reassuring letters, and we read them now, and we are comforted by them, and we should not be, because in many cases, they were the careful constructions of women, who were quietly drowning, and determined that no one should know. The cheerfulness we inherited was, so often, a performance. The real feeling was sealed away beneath it, unspoken, unrecorded, carried alone. There were things that helped, when they could be had, and we will come to those, because the story is not only darkness, and it would be a lie to tell it as though it were. But the help was thin, and far between, and a great many women had very little of it, and faced the long isolation, with almost nothing to lean on, but their own dwindling strength. Some endured it, and came out the other side hardened and intact. Some endured it, and were never quite the same again, carrying a permanent quietness, a part of themselves that had gone away out there and not fully returned. And some did not endure it, and their stories ended on the prairie in ways their families afterward did not speak of. Wife and mother lost not to cholera or childbirth or winter, but to the simple, terrible weight of being alone for too long in a place too large and too silent for the human heart. So, we have to hold both of these truths at once, and holding both is the only honest way to understand these women. They were extraordinarily strong, and the strength cost them something almost unimaginable, paid in a currency that left no visible mark, drawn quietly from the deepest part of them, year after year, in a silence that the comfortable story has never once acknowledged. They smiled in the photographs. They wrote that all was well, and we believed them, for 150 years. But solitude was not the only thing the prairie used against them, and the human spirit, even worn thin, does not give up easily, and it does not face the darkness with nothing. Because even out there, in all that emptiness, these women found ways to reach one another, and to hold on, and to keep a small light burning against the vast dark. And those ways, those small and stubborn mercies, are the part of the story we have not told yet, and they are, I think, the part that will stay with you longest. It would be easy, having come this far, to think of these women only as victims, only as figures of suffering, ground down by labour and loss and loneliness until there was nothing left. And that would be a failure of understanding, and worse, it would be a kind of disrespect, because it would miss the most important thing about them, which is not what was done to them, but what they did in return. They did not simply endure. They fought back against the bleakness, with the only weapons they had, which were each other, and their faith, and an absolutely unkillable human determination to make meaning and beauty and connection even in a place that offered them almost none. And to understand how they survived, not just in body but in spirit, you have to understand the things they reached for in the dark, because they did reach. And sometimes their hands found something to hold, The first and greatest of these was other women. We have talked about how isolation starved them of female company, and that was true, and it was the wound. But precisely because that company was so scarce, it became almost unbearably precious, and the bonds that did form between frontier women were not the casual friendships of easier lives. They were lifelines, fierce and deep, and absolutely essential. And women would travel astonishing distances and overcome real hardship simply to be in one another's presence for a few hours. A neighbor woman 3 or 4 miles off was a treasure beyond price. When two women within reach of each other managed to meet, the talk poured out of them. All the words that had been dammed up for weeks of silence, and in that talk they gave each other the one thing the prairie withheld, and the soul could not do without, which was to be known, to be heard, to be reminded that one was not alone in the universe after all. These friendships held women together through everything. And when the worst came, when a woman was in labor, or gravely ill, or had lost a child, it was these other women who came, who rode through whatever weather, who took over the house and the cooking and the children, who sat up through the nights, who washed the body when washing the body was what was needed, and held the living when holding was what was needed. The old web of female hands that the trail had torn apart, these women patiently, stubbornly rebuilt, thread by thread, across all that distance, because they could not survive without it, and they knew it. And out of that need grew the small gatherings that became the bright points in the calendar of a frontier woman's year, the events she looked forward to for months and remembered for months after. There was the quilting, which deserves a special mention, because it was so much more than the making of bed coverings. A quilting was a gathering, an occasion, a reason for the scattered women of a district to come together in one house and spend a whole day in each other's company, their hands busy with the needles while their voices were busy with everything that had happened since the last time. The quilts they made this way were beautiful and useful and warm, and they were something else too. They were a record, pieced together from scraps of worn-out dresses and outgrown shirts, and the fabric of a family's whole history, so that a finished quilt held within it the story of the people it had clothed. But the real thing being stitched at a quilting was not the quilt, it was the community. It was the bonds between the women, reaffirmed and strengthened with every shared hour, and a woman could live a long time on the warmth of one good quilting day, carry it back to her solitary claim, and unfold the memory of it on the lonely nights, the way she unfolded the quilt itself against the cold. There were the other gatherings too, rarer and more precious for their rarity. A wedding would draw families from across an entire region, everyone travelling in for a celebration that might last a full day and night, with music and dancing and food, and the simple intoxicating joy of being among many people at once. A barn raising or a house raising brought the men together to do in a single day, through shared labour, what a family could never have done alone, while the women cooked and gathered and turned the work into a festival. Even a funeral, sombre as it was, served this binding purpose, bringing the scattered settlers together to stand around a grave, and then to sit together afterward, to share food and grief and presents, so that no one had to mourn entirely alone. These gatherings were the heartbeat of frontier social life, infrequent but vital, and between them a woman lived on memory and anticipation, looking back at the last one, and forward to the next, and the prospect of company on some distant date was sometimes the thing that got her through a hard stretch of solitude. As the settlement slowly took root and grew, 2 institutions arrived that changed everything, and women were very often at the centre of bringing them into being. The first was the church, for people of deep faith, and most of them were, the establishment of a church, even a humble one meeting in someone's sod house, before any building could be raised, was an event of enormous importance, and not only for the spiritual comfort it offered, though that was real and sustaining, it was also the great social gathering of the week, the one reliable occasion when the families of a district came together, the place where news was exchanged, and friendships were maintained, and a lonely woman could count on seeing other faces and hearing other voices. The second institution was the school, and the school mattered to mothers with a particular intensity, because it was for the children, because it meant the next generation would have something the parents had risked everything to provide. A future better than dirt and isolation. Schools often began in the most makeshift way. A few children gathered in a sod house, with a young woman teaching them, and the schoolhouse, once built, became another hub of the growing community, another place where the scattered life of the prairie could knit itself together into something more like a society. Women fought for these things. They organized them and hosted them and taught in them and held them together because they understood, better than anyone, that survival was not only a matter of food and shelter but of connection, and that a community was the thing that stood between them and the silence. Faith itself, beyond the gathering of the church, was for many of these women the deep bedrock they stood on through everything. It is difficult to overstate how much religious belief sustained the people of the frontier, and the women especially. When a woman buried a child, it was the belief that she would see that child again that allowed her to rise the next morning and go on living. When the loneliness pressed in, it was prayer that gave her someone to speak to in the empty house, a presence to fill the silence the wind could not. When the future looked like nothing but more hardship, it was faith that there was meaning in the suffering, that it was seen, that it counted for something which kept despair at bay. We may believe what they believed, or we may not, but we cannot understand them without understanding that for a great many of these women, faith was not a decoration on their lives. It was the load-bearing wall. It was the thing that did not break when everything else was breaking, and it carried them through valleys that nothing else could have carried them through. And then, there were the small things, the private mercies, the tiny rebellions of beauty and pleasure that women carved out of the hardship. And these are the details that I find the most moving of all, because they show the spirit refusing to be extinguished. There was music, a fiddle, or a few voices raised in song in the evening, a hymn or an old tune from back home, filling the dark room with something other than the wind. There was the deep, simple pleasure of the children, who were exhausting and endangered and endless work, and who were also, every one of them, a reason to keep going, a small warm life laughing in the doorway, a future taking its first steps across the dirt floor. There was the satisfaction of the work itself when it went well, the pride in a good loaf of bread, a full pantry going into winter, a garden coaxed out of stubborn ground, the deep human pleasure of competence and of providing for the people you love. And there was the land, which took so much, but which also, on certain mornings, gave something back, a sunrise across the grass that stopped a woman in her tracks, the immense clean sky after a storm, the wild beauty of a place that was as magnificent as it was cruel, and many of these women, for all their suffering, came to love it fiercely, this hard country that had taken so much from them, and that was, after all, now theirs. This is the balance that the honest story has to keep, and it is a hard balance to hold, because both sides of it are completely true. The life was brutal, and the life was not only brutal, there was real joy in it, real love, real beauty, real meaning, found and made and defended by women in the teeth of everything arrayed against them. They were not only suffering, they were living, fully, fiercely, with laughter and friendship and faith and song woven right through the hardship, and to remember them, only, for their pain, would be to take from them the very thing they fought hardest to keep, which was their humanity, their joy, their stubborn insistence on making a real and human life out of the impossible materials they were given. They sang in the dark. They made beauty out of scraps. They built community out of distance and held each other up across the empty miles. That is not a story of victims. That is a story of some of the strongest and most fully alive people this country has ever produced. And yet, for all of it, for all the friendship and faith song, the prairie kept its own counsel, and the prairie kept its own toll, and in the end, there was a reckoning that came for every one of these women, sooner or later, in one form or another. For some it came in the killing cold of a single winter night. For some it came as the slow defeat that sent them packing, beaten, off the land that had broken them. And for all of them, eventually, it came as the end of the long road itself. We have walked with her, from the doorway of her old home, all the way out to the silent claim under the enormous sky. There is one part of the journey left. We have to walk with her to the end. If the summers on the plains were hard, the winters were something else entirely. The winters were a siege. And to a woman alone on a homestead, the coming of winter was the coming of a season that could, with very little warning, simply kill her family. And there was a particular kind of fear that settled over the prairie as the days shortened and the first hard cold came down out of the north, because everyone who had lived through one of these winters knew exactly what the season was capable of. The cold itself is difficult to convey to anyone who has not felt that kind of cold. On the northern plains, the temperature in the depths of winter could fall to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero, and stay there for days, for weeks, a cold so profound and so sustained that it became the entire condition of existence, a thing to be survived hour by hour. And the cold did not come alone. It came with the wind, always the wind, and the wind across an open plain in winter does not merely chill, it strips the warmth out of a living body with terrifying speed, so that exposed flesh could freeze in minutes, and a person caught out in it without shelter could die in a span of time shockingly short. The family huddled in the sod house, which we have already credited for holding its warmth, and thank God it did, because the alternative was death, but holding warmth required fuel, and fuel in winter was the thing that stood between a family and freezing. The woman watched the fuel supply the way a sailor watches the water, because if the twisted hay and the dung, and whatever scarce wood there was, ran low in the middle of a long cold snap, with no way to gather more in the killing weather outside, the situation could turn desperate with frightening speed. But the cold that simply sat on the land, brutal as it was, could at least be prepared for. The thing that truly terrified the people of the plains was the blizzard, the sudden storm, the whiteout, and to understand why, you only have to know the story of a single day, a day that has never been forgotten in that part of the country, a day that shows you everything the prairie winter could do. It was the 12th of January in the year 1888. The morning of that day, across the Dakotas and Nebraska and Minnesota and the surrounding country, dawned strangely, wonderfully mild. After a stretch of bitter cold, the air had warmed, the sun was out, the snow was softening, and to people who had been shut in by the weather, it felt like a reprieve, like a gift, and so they did what anyone would do. They went out. Farmers hitched up and went to town for the errands that had been waiting. And the children, who had been kept home through the frigid days before, were bundled off to school, walking across the open country to the one-room schoolhouses scattered around the district, glad to be out in the mild, bright morning. No one knew. There was almost no way for them to know, because the weather service of that era was in its infancy and could not have warned them in time, even if it had understood what was coming. What was coming was a wall. Out of the northwest, with almost no warning, an enormous mass of Arctic air came roaring down across the plains, and when it arrived not as a gradual change, but as a sudden, violent transformation of the world. Witnesses described a dark cloud on the horizon, an eerie stillness, and then the storm hit like a physical blow, a shrieking wall of wind and fine driving snow that turned the bright morning into a blind white chaos in a matter of minutes. The temperature did not drop, it collapsed, plunging dozens of degrees in mere hours, in some places falling toward 40 below, with the wind howling at speeds that made the cold lethal almost instantly. And the snow was not the soft snow of the morning. It was fine and hard, and driven by the wind into a whiteout so total that a person could not see their own hands, could see not a building a few steps away, could not tell up from down or north from south, in a screaming white blindness that erased the entire world, and the children were at school, far from home. This is why that day has its name. We remember it as the children's blizzard, also called the schoolhouse blizzard. And the reason is the terrible position it put 100 teachers in all at once, scattered across the plains in their little schoolhouses, most of them young women, some barely more than girls themselves. The storm hit in the afternoon, near the time school would let out, and each teacher faced the same impossible decision, with no way to know the right answer and lives hanging on it. Should she keep the children at the school, where there was at least walls and perhaps a little fuel, and hope the storm passed and the parents understood? Or should she send them home, or try to lead them home, before the fuel ran out and the building grew as cold as the air outside? The histories of that day record that the teachers who kept their children gathered at the school generally saw them through alive, while many of the children who set out into that whiteout to find their way home never arrived, lost within sight of safety, frozen in the open country, found later when the storm had passed. There was a young teacher in Nebraska named Minnie Freeman, and when the storm tore the very roof from her one-room schoolhouse, she made her decision, and she got her school full of children out and led them through the blizzard to shelter, every one of them, and she became a heroine, her name sung in songs afterward, and her story is the one we tell when we want to believe in the best of people. But there was another teacher, also young, also in Nebraska, named Lois Royce, and her story is the one that tells the truth about that day. She was trapped in her schoolhouse with 3 children, 2 of them 9 years old and one only 6. When their fuel gave out and the cold began to win, she made the choice to try to lead them to her boarding house, which stood only about 80 yards away, a distance you could normally cross in a moment. In the whiteout, they lost their way. They could not find the house. They could not find anything. And out there in the blind white raw, so close to safety, the 3 children in her care froze to death, one after another, while she could do nothing to save them. She herself survived, and lived, but her feet were so badly frozen that they had to be amputated, and she carried the loss of those children, and the loss of her feet, for the rest of her life. When that single storm finally passed, the death toll across the plains was counted, and the count was somewhere around 235 people, with some estimates running far higher, and a great many of the dead were children. The chronicler David Laskin, who told the full story of that day in his account of the disaster, captured what it meant for that society, which was that there was hardly a family across the whole affected region who was not touched by it, who had not lost someone or did not know a family who had. One storm, one afternoon, that is what the prairie winter could do, and every woman on every homestead lived with the knowledge that it could happen again. Any winter, any day that dawned a little too mild, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it, but watch the sky and pray and keep the fuel stocked and the children close. Even the winters that brought no great killing storm brought their own grinding ordeal. The long imprisonment of the cold months, when the family was shut up together in the single dim room for weeks on end, unable to travel, unable to gather, the isolation we have already spoken of, deepened now into something near total. The world shrank to the walls of the soddy. The work went on, the fire and the cooking and the endless care. But the small mercies that made the warmer months bearable, the gatherings, the visits, the church, all of it became impossible, and a woman who was already lonely found herself sealed into a frozen solitude that could last from autumn deep into spring. The winters tested the marriages and tested the minds and tested the supplies and tested the will, and they did it every single year, and a woman who had survived one knew exactly what she was facing when she watched the geese fly south and felt the first hard edge come into the wind. It is no wonder, then, knowing all of this, the summers and the winters and the labour and the births and the losses and the loneliness, that so many of these families finally broke. We have to sit with something we already know but feel differently, now that we have travelled this far with her. The families who broke and walked away from their claims were not weak. They had simply been asked to do something that, for most who attempted it, was not actually possible. And behind that cold statistic are a great many quiet defeats, a great many mornings when a family that had risked everything, that had left a home behind, and crossed a continent and buried children in prairie soil and given years of their lives to the land, finally admitted that they could not do it, that the land had beaten them, and loaded what was left of their possessions, and turned the wagon around and went away, back east, or on to a town, or to start again somewhere less cruel, leaving behind the soddy they had built, and the graves they had dug, and the dream they had believed in. We do not tell their stories much, the ones who failed, because failure does not make a stirring legend. But they were not weak. They had simply been asked to do something that was, for more than half of those who attempted it, not actually possible, and the wonder is not that so many gave up, but that any of them succeeded at all. And for those who did not turn back, who stayed, who held on through the summers and the winters and the years until the land was finally, truly theirs, there was still one more thing the prairie was waiting to collect. The last thing. The thing it collects from all of us in the end. The woman who endured all of it, who outlasted the trail and the labour and the loneliness and the killing seasons, came at last to the end of her own long road. And where that road ended, and what she left behind when it did, and why it matters so much that we remember her now, is the last thing we have to talk about tonight. In the end, she died the way she had lived, quietly and out there. Some of these women died young, worn out before their time by the life we have spent this long night describing. Some, against all the odds, lived to be old, sitting at last in a real house their family had finally managed to build, surrounded by grown children, and a whole community that had risen up around the place where they had once stood entirely alone. But however it came, when it came, it usually came on the land that had taken so much from her, and she was usually laid to rest in the same prairie soil into which she had already buried so much of herself, in one of the small country cemeteries that dot the plains, on a rise of ground, with the grass moving all around it, and the enormous sky overhead, and the wind that had been with her all her life, still blowing across the place where they put her down. And here is the thing about those graves, the thing that I find I cannot stop thinking about. Many of them are gone now. Not the bodies, but the memory of them, the knowledge of who lies where. The little family burial plots on the old claims, the ones tended faithfully for a generation, passed out of the family when the land was sold, or the family died out, and the wooden markers rotted away, and the small fences fell, and the prairie did what the prairie does, which is to take everything back into itself. And so all across the middle of this country, beneath fields of wheat and corn that stretch to the horizon, beneath highways and towns, lie the unmarked graves of frontier women whose names no one now remembers, whose stories were never written down, who lived their entire enormous lives of labour, and love and loss, and endurance, and then vanished so completely that we do not even know they were there. The land kept them. It kept them and it forgot them, and we forgot them, and that forgetting is the final injustice in a life that was full of injustices. And it is the thing that this night, this telling, is meant in some small way to set right. Because I want to be honest with you, fully honest, in a way the comfortable story never is, and that means saying a hard thing clearly. This land that these women settled, this prairie they suffered to claim, was not empty. We speak of it as wilderness, as open country waiting for someone to tame it, but it was not waiting, and it was not empty. It was home to peoples who had lived upon it for countless generations, who had their own mothers and their own children and their own ways of life, and the arrival of the homesteaders, the very story we have been telling, was for those peoples the beginning of a catastrophe, the loss of their land and their world. The 160 acres that the government gave away so generously were not the government's to give. The full truth of the frontier holds both of these things at once, the genuine suffering of the settler women and the far greater suffering of people whose home was being taken. And a story that tells only one half is not the whole truth, and you deserve the whole truth, even at the end of a long and quiet night, perhaps especially then. So let us set the comfortable picture down for the last time, gently, and look at it once more for what it was. The cheerful pioneer mother in the clean blue dress, baking bread in her tidy cabin, smiling out at the picturesque prairie, the image we began with, the image we have all carried in our minds since we were children. We can see now, I hope, how much that picture leaves out, and how much it costs to leave it out. It leaves out the morning she lost her mother forever. It leaves out the graves along the trail, and the small body she covered with stones and walked away from. It leaves out the dirt house, and the endless labour, and the ruined hands. It leaves out the children she buried in the yard, and the fevers she could do nothing to stop. It leaves out the silence that nearly broke her mind, and the cheerful letters that hid how close she came. It leaves out the killing winters, and the half of them who failed, and the unmarked grave under the wheat. The comfortable picture is not just incomplete. It is, in a way, a theft, because it takes a woman who endured something close to the limit of what a human being can endure, and it replaces her with a pleasant fiction who endured nothing at all. And in doing so, it robs her of the one thing she earned with her whole life, which is to be truly seen. I am aware of the hour. I know that some of you have been drifting as I talk, sinking towards sleep, and that is exactly as it should be. That is what this is for, and I am glad to be the voice that walks you down toward rest. But before you go all the way under, I want to ask you to carry one small thing down into sleep with you, and it is this. The next time you see that pretty picture of the pioneer woman, the next time the gentle, golden, softened version of this story drifts across your path in a film or a book or a faded painting, I want you to remember that underneath it there was a real woman. A woman no stronger than you, no braver than you, who did not ask for any of it, who was simply handed an impossible life, and got up every morning and lived it anyway, without applause, without rest, without ever once being told that what she was doing was extraordinary. She will never know that we spoke of her tonight. She never knew, in her own life, that anyone would ever care. But we can know it now, on her behalf. We can give her, across all the years, the one thing she was never given while she lived, which is simply to be remembered as she truly was. There is a strange and beautiful echo at the very end of this story, and it is the reason a flicker of these women has survived at all, because some of the children did remember. Some of the daughters and the granddaughters, who grew up in those soddies and on those claims, who watched their mothers labour and grieve and endure, carried the memory of it forward into a later and easier time, and a few of them wrote it down, in diaries and letters and recollections, and even, here and there, in stories that the whole world would one day read. The gentle, golden tales of prairie childhood that so many of us were raised on, the ones that taught us to picture the brave little cabin, and the loving family, and the simple sweetness of the frontier. Those very stories were written by women looking back across the years at lives that had, in truth, been far harder than the softened versions they chose to tell. The comfort we inherited was real, but it was a comfort built on top of a deep and largely hidden well of suffering. And the women who did the suffering, the mothers in the background of those sweet stories, the worn and silent figures at the edge of the golden light, those were the real heroines all along, and almost no one ever told you their story straight. Tonight, I hope, someone finally did. If anything in this long night stayed with you, I would be grateful if you left a single thought in the comments before you sleep. Not for me, but for them. Tell me about a woman in your own family, a grandmother or a great-grandmother, someone who endured something hard and quiet, and never asked to be thanked for it. Say her name, because that is the whole of it, in the end. These women were uncounted and unnamed and unthanked in their own time. And the smallest thing we can do, the very least, is to refuse to let that be the final word, to say a name out loud, to remember that she was here. And now I will let you go. Let the picture fade. Let my voice grow quiet. Think as you drift off of a single sod house far out on a dark and endless plain, 150 years ago, with one small window holding back the night. Inside, a woman lies awake in the dark, listening to the wind lean against the walls of a house made of earth, the way it has every night and will every night to come. She reaches out in the blackness, and she feels her children breathing, warm and close and alive, and that small certainty is enough. It is the whole of her world, and it is enough, and she closes her eyes. She has no idea that she matters. She has no idea that anyone will ever know her name, or speak of her, or weep a little for all she carried. She only knows that her children are breathing, and that tomorrow she will rise before the sun and keep them alive for one more day, the way she always has. Rest well. She did the impossible so quietly that history nearly missed it. Tonight, we did not miss her. Good night.